We start the first for today, panel 6, day 2 of the conference. The name of the panel is the day after: New Constitution, New Federalism, New Economy, and New Foreign Policy. We have 1.5 hours for it, and we'll do our best to give an opportunity to give the floor to all the panel members briefly, and if we have enough time, we may answer a few questions from the floor. You may have this opportunity to ask questions at the end. If we look at the name of the panel, it is evident that it deals or it makes sense for the post-Putin Russia. At the time when there are opportunities to re-establish Russia and a new Russian constitution, to establish a new regulatory framework, to ultimately abandon the past of the Putin's Russia, and it seems that that's the only thing we should discuss here. Nevertheless, I would like our panel interventions to touch upon the technical issues, if possible. What of the above mentioned can be done right now, exactly at this moment of time, not once there is an opportunity after Putin is gone, as well as his regime, maybe after the war ends. But what of the above can be done immediately? Is it possible to declare, for example, a new constitution in Belgrade if it is seized in the coming months? Is it possible to establish an alternative state power, government, powers of government based on this new constitution in a new free part of Russia? And this may emerge. Is it possible to showcase in a small spot of European land that there is an alternative to the existing regime in Russia? Is it possible to establish new armed forces, new police bodies, new non-corrupt and free authority in this piece of land? Can Russia be within the boundaries which we know, or it can become a pilot in a small spot in one federation part? This may be adjacent to Ukraine, and this will be the outcome of the war. And the 20th century saw similar cases. Is it possible to establish something that would be strongly different from what there is in the Empire Moscow and whatever we associate with Putin's Russia? I believe that these are the issues to be discussed by our panelists, apart from the strategic vision of what Russia can be in the future. When speaking about the constitution, it will make sense to discuss the dichotomy between the emperor state and the national state. Is it possible to have a Russian national state as an alternative to the empire state, as one of the models of pro-European development? After the breakup of the USSR, countries did that. They established their own national states. These are the pathways for nation building, or Russia can jump into the pan-European space and become a West-oriented and West-defined Western civilization state, and a country that will be westernized in a short term. If it is new federalism, then in the 20th century it was not possible to get rid of it, despite all efforts for this country to be the prison of nations. Is it possible to give an opportunity to nations to separate from Russia, to stop being a one single state? Can this be a next step for disintegration, like in 1991? And basically speaking, what the economy and foreign policy of this new state should be? And the answer seems evident, but nevertheless, the risks in this combination predetermine the ideological future of the country. Russia is staying as a marginal state, sub-marginal space. Inside of it, there is the western part and the Asian part. And the current efforts of the regime in Moscow, together with Putin, who is leading the pro-Chinese party, can lead to the situation when Russia may get rid of Putin and not decide still whether it is the West or the East. So that's the panel. I pass the floor to Dmitry KHODORKOVSKY from the Anti-War Committee, and I will not be introducing other panelists. I would like Mr. KHODORKOVSKY to discuss this and other issues. The floor is yours. I welcome all of you. Thank you very much. You provided a very broad landscape of the current issues and the issues of long-term nature. And maybe I won't be able to cover all of them. As for me, there are a few critical and essential issues that I would like to discuss. As for today, we, in the environment of the Russian opposition, and I'm going to be speaking about the largest forces, have come to, a few years ago, we have come to consensus about the future of Russia. Parliamentary republic, not the current presidential republic. Well, presidential under the constitution or super-presidential republic under the constitution, and the necessity to federalize the state. The situation when the authorities of the country's regions are more significant if compared to the authorities of the federal center, and the federal center utilizes the authorities delegated to it by the regions. I believe that this challenge is absolutely relevant today. These are the two concept pillars, and we have the key conclusions based on them for the war to end in fair peace and fair victory of Ukraine. The first story is about federalization. I know there are enough people who are for disintegration of Russia, not for re-establishment, not for Russia to lose some of the remote areas, not for the rights of the regions, but for disintegration, breakup of Russia. This is a possible scenario, and this scenario is supported by Putin staying in power. If this situation continues for the next 10 to 15 years, this will be inevitable. I believe it is highly dangerous for those who today want to see fair victory of Ukraine in the war, for those who look forward to a peaceful European future, to be speaking about disintegration of Russia. not to plan it, but even to speak about it. Why I insist on this hypothesis? There are two sides in this camp. It is not critical what side is primary, but I would put the Russian side as the primary one. There are people who are not concerned about the war or support its continuation, and we do understand that the majority of Russians are like that. This is the largest majority. Medusa has made a survey, and we can see it in other quality surveys. The war with Ukraine was a mistake. That's the thesis. And this audience is already in their minds. However, we should win, because if we do not win, then Russia will break up. So this is an incentive for a huge portion of the Russian society to continue to support the war, because they're afraid of the disintegration of the country. They are afraid that not some Putin and other military criminals will suffer because of the Ukrainians' victory, not because Ukraine will return the areas that are her parts legitimately. This is the fear of the disintegration of their own lives, and we speak about the lives of dozens of millions of people. They are afraid of it, and they are ready to protect this interest of them. Therefore, when we speak about the disintegration of Russia, we superimpose ourselves harshly to these dozens of millions of people. Should we do it? Should we put them in the camp of Putin, or shall we remove them from that camp? I believe this question is beyond dispute. Another challenge are the politicians who make decisions in the West about supplies of weaponry and to support Ukraine. I mean, European politicians and the US politicians. For the majority of them, disintegration of Russia is a nightmare, for clear reasons. I don't think we should dive into it, but this is the actual state of the things. We can speculate whether this is fair or not, but this is the actual state of the things. This is a nightmare for them. In my view, this is a fair perception, because 5 to 7 states with administrative borders and these states carrying nuclear weapons, it's like India and Pakistan multiplied by 5. What? Beg your pardon? No, it's okay. So these people withhold their assistance to Ukraine, or they're ready to withhold it because they're afraid of the disintegration of Russia. If we say that Russia, through the victory of Ukraine, may, can, and even should disintegrate, we tell these people, beware. Be careful with your assistance to Ukraine, because otherwise Russia will disintegrate. No, we should be saying as is. Today there are no prerequisites for disintegration of Russia, but these prerequisites may emerge if Putin stays in power, and in my view this is guaranteed. This challenge, the challenge of discussing the disintegration of the state, is a critically important thing. The second important issue is the issue of the parliamentary republic. It is important today, not tomorrow, when the Putin's regime is defeated, because when it falls tomorrow, there will be a little time frame, and then Russia will either enter a new circle of authoritarian state or will try moving again to democracy. Why is it relevant today? It's important today because there are two models of moving towards regime change. First is the Revolutionary Party. The other model is a broad coalition, the Popular Front. We should understand that the Revolutionary Party can seize power, but the likelihood that this will enable us to enter a new circle of authoritarian state is almost 100% guaranteed. If the coalition comes to power, then the likelihood of Russia to become a democracy gets higher. Well, this is not guaranteed 100%, but the chances are higher significantly. What is the current challenge? This is what we discussed actively yesterday with the colleagues in the chats. A leader or the leader. If we speak about the presidential model done in Russia, we need the leader. And then all ambitious politicians that oppose to the regime should fight for it. If we speak about the parliamentary republic, then we speak about a leader or a large number of leaders, each of them representing his or her own group, regional, sectoral, social, etc. Everybody present here is a leader, I hope. And these leaders learn how to agree between them, and the parliamentary model enables these leaders to do so, unlike the presidential model. I'm happy that Alexei Navalny, for some time ago, at last supported the idea of the parliamentary republic. I believe that the number of the opponents of this model is smaller. And at last, there are two small details I would like to focus on. This is the issue of lustration and the issue of nationalization. We won't avoid these two issues, and we should be discussing them today. The lustration issue is quite dangerous if we want to have civil peace. Then we should understand that the majority of the country's population will have to believe that their interests will be represented in a new political system, and not 50%, as Vladimir Putin says, that democracy is when the minority obeys to the majority. Not 70%, but over 90%, even 10% of people who believe that the new powers will critically suppress their interests. That's the pathway to civil war, and nobody needs it. Therefore, when we speak about total lustration covering millions of people, is the pathway to civil war. Think about it in your rhetoric. And at last, nationalization or privatization. We have been discussing old privatization and we fairly discuss it and condemn it. And this is a difficult and convoluted issue, and it touches the feelings. I'm not going to dwell on this. The situation today is as follows. The majority of the Russian well-being is controlled by the Putin's coup, either directly or indirectly, but they control it. And this situation cannot continue. Not from the fairness point of view, nor from the political rationality point of view. Today we should clearly tell these people, those who help them hiding their assets, the Rodenbergs, the Kovalchuks, will not save these assets, will not create their own well-being, but they will create a situation of a real and serious criminal prosecution around the world. This should be discussed today, because otherwise these people hope, and this hope replenishes the squads of Putin who would like to maintain this situation at least until they manage to hide their well-being. Let's not leave this hope to them. In my convictions, I am the person who is more to the right, not to the left side, but in this situation, I'm ready to be a leftist. Thank you. Thank you. We have a video message by Sergei GURIEV. Sergei GURIEV, economist, professor of economics at the Department of Economics and Sciences in Paris.
If I'm speaking to you from Paris, I'm very sorry I couldn't come to this very important conference today. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and also for giving me this opportunity to record this video, in which I will try to address several of the questions raised for the day 2 of the conference for this particular panel. What is going to happen the day after? We, in realistic terms, should not expect that Russia will become a democratic state right away. Most likely, Putin will be succeeded by people from his own government, and initially we will have to understand how to arrange the conversation between the non-war criminals. War criminals will be tried by international tribunals at some point, but non-war criminals in the government, the Western counterparts, Ukrainian counterparts, and the Russian opposition. Why would Putin's lieutenants be interested in such a conversation? The answer is very simple. Putin, whatever we think about him, does have certain support in Russian society, certain charisma. His lieutenants do not. So they will need another source of legitimacy. It is quite likely that there will be some infighting for months or even a year or two within the close circle of Putin's lieutenants, but eventually some of them, one of them, a group of them, will try to find legitimacy in economic performance. To provide economic benefits to Russian population, they will ask for removal of sanctions. This is the moment where the West and Ukraine can impose conditions. Now, these conditions should include, of course, peace in Ukraine, removing the troops from Ukraine, and so on, reparations, international tribunals for war criminals, but also liberalization of Russian political life, immediate release of all political prisoners, and creation of a transit governance structure. This governance structure, like in other post-dictatorial societies, will include the members of the outgoing regime and also some representatives of Russian opposition. This roundtable will have to work out the details of two very important processes. One is establishing constitutional assembly, which will write a new constitution, which will launch Russian democratic process, recreate Russia as a federal, decentralized parliamentary republic. On the other hand, this council, this collegial body, this roundtable will have to call for new elections. And apparently, initially, we will have to go back to 1993 constitution and use it as the only consistent constitution we have in place. We'll have to roll back all the repressive and unjust laws that were introduced in the last 10-15 years by Russian parliament and by Putin's regime to provide conditions for open political process in this first democratic election. At the same time, as I said, we also will need to call for a constitutional assembly. Now, a lot of people will talk about political aspects of this transition. I would just say that we will need to move, as I said, to federal decentralized parliamentary republic. In economic terms, the main challenges will be removing sanctions, removing barriers to competition, opening up Russian economy, reintroducing Russia into the global economy, and of course improving relations with the main trading partners, most importantly with Europe. Russia will start to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union, and that will per se improve investment climate and economic growth. Now, in terms of other most important economic challenges, these are actually not economic but political challenges. This is judiciary reform that will rebuild confidence in rule of law. This is reform of law and order agencies. Some law and order agencies or law and order agencies will have to be disbanded, and that of course applies to FSB. But these are the most important steps to improve business environment. Another economic reform is deregulation, drastic deregulation, and reduction of bureaucratic barriers. Another important economic reform, which is a prerequisite for federalist reform, is reform of Moscow region's cities' fiscal relations. Even if we decentralized authority, that is not enough. We also need to decentralize income sources, income bases, tax bases. If a region has authority over schools or roads, it's not enough if it doesn't have income to pay for those schools and roads. And finally, I would, as an educator, I would mention one important issue. We will also have to change the education in secondary and high schools, especially education in social sciences, especially education in history. The radical deputinization, radical de-imperialization is not feasible, as we've learned in recent decades, without rewriting history textbooks, without providing Russian kids with the correct version of history, the version of history which shows what has gone wrong in the recent Russian history, in the recent centuries, and provide the right vision of what Russia should be, which is a democratic, peaceful, prosperous Russia, and not an empire that projects fear to the neighbors. Thank you very much.
Благодарим Сергея Гуриева.
Thank you, Sergei Guriev. Now we're giving the floor to Sergey ALEKSASHENKO, the economist representing the Russian Anti-War Committee. Thank you so much. As was said, I'm an economist. Everyone can hurt economists. Today in the morning, Georgi hurt me, who said that no one wants to listen to history. And yesterday, Roma Liberov said no one wants to listen about culture. I see it as an insult. So I will start my today's presentation with the history and historical parallels. Of course, 1917 is a good point for comparison, but I have another point in mind. 1945, when two aggressive states, Germany and Japan, were defeated. They lost the war. And in that time, the West, probably represented by the US, the UK, some parts of France following de Gaulle, had no worse enemy than these two regimes. Before the invasion in Normandy, Sergei Morgenthau presented his plan to President Roosevelt, how to prevent Japan from launching the Third World War. And this was about separating Germany to three parts: deindustrialization, establishing international zone in Ruhr, so impoverishing Germany. And honestly, during the first years, like 1945 or 1946, they were close to implementing this, also because Comrade Stalin helped. This was the only country which demanded reparations from Germany, and they took all equipment from Eastern Germany to Soviet Union. Unluckily for Morgenthau, it appeared that 1945-1946 had bad harvest, and the situation went to hunger in Germany. And the attempts to help the Western Europe, which later was named Marshall Plan, the maths didn't work. The American Congress was very stubborn. They will say, we will give 17 billion US dollars, not more. So 17 billion should be enough to restore Europe. Or we don't care about Europe. It felt like it was not enough without including Germany. And when Germany was included, then the European economy started to work as a model. 1 more year took to persuade France with this approach. That Germany should not be seen as an enemy. Germany should not be seen as an opponent. Germany should be seen as a partner. In 1948, they started implementing Marshall Plan, and Germany turned into one of the closest economic partners. It became the part of the US economic bloc, becoming one of the closest partners of the Western economy. In 1949, they held the first elections in Germany, controlled by occupying powers, by the laws of occupying powers. In 1953, 1 more parliamentary elections happened in Germany. In 1955, Germany joined NATO, and Western Germany became military and political ally of the US, and it turned into a peaceful, flourishing country, not threatening the world. And it took quite a long time to force Germany to change its attitude on war in Ukraine. In Japan, the process was very similar. The same, of course, different occupying administration. General MacArthur enforced democratization in 1946, allowing communists and trade unions to participate in elections. Communists were banned in Japan, and administration of MacArthur required that they allowed communists to run. The left movement in elections 1946, 47, 49, almost every year they had elections to the state parliament in Japan. It was hard to stabilize the situation. In 1950, Korean War started. The Japanese economy. Americans realized that it's easier to produce what they need for the war in Korea in Japan rather than export from the US. Japan became the ally of America. They got their own Marshall Plan and military orders from the US. In 1955, they had a Red Purge and communists were removed from everywhere. In 1951, the occupation of Japan was over. San Francisco Agreement was signed, and in addition, the US-Japan Agreement on Military Alliance was signed. So, without having its army, Japan forcefully became the member of alliance with the US. So that was the history of two aggressive countries. And currently these countries probably are one of the closest political allies of the US. But we see that in all cases there was very strong pressure from occupying powers and very tough democratization demand and military and political alliance. One more example that we have is 1991. If we read American newspapers, and maybe even now, many experts and many politicians say, We have won in the Cold War. Maybe the US has, but we don't know who lost. Definitely Russia did not lose, which emerged on the ruins of Soviet Union. In 1991-92, Russia didn't see itself as the losing country. Russia believed that it also won in the Cold War. Unluckily for Russia, and Russian transformation, 1992 was very difficult for the US politically. The political struggle was underway and economic recession. Americans didn't care much about Russia. President Bush didn't want to help Russia economically. In the end, in April, he said that we will create the plan for 24 billion, but America will provide only 5, while others should give the rest, like Germany, Japan, and international organizations. German and Japanese prime ministers only found out about it from the press because no one had discussed it with them. And of course, there was no significant economic help coming for Russia. They did not open the European markets for Russia. And one of the most serious problems of Russian transformation, which was underestimated by many, neither by Russian economists, Western economists, and IMF, was that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet and Russian economy was not competitive. Everyone thought that this is a big economy, 60% of US economy, that it will develop, but they found out that it cannot produce anything competitive. So, from the point of view of actual collapse of living standard, it was not exactly Germany and Japan after the World War II, which was 30% of 1938, but the drop was more than 50%, which is comparable. And there was no inclusion. It's not even about money. Jackson-Vanik amendment was in force until 2011, so Russia was not included in any alliance, and money was not given to Russia. The same happened to the political alliance. The attempt to say, let's bring together Russia and NATO, this was not very successful. Americans became interested in expanding NATO. Unluckily, 1993 occurred. In Yeltsin entourage, hawks became more influential. Chechen War started, and everyone realized that military alliance is not possible with Russia. And what was the end? Unwillingness of the West to create not to create the alliance, but to include Russia in its economic and military orbit, resulted in what we have now. I think this is the main lesson of history that we all saw. We should remember it. So now about the tactics. The future will be bright and it will be good, but the problem is we don't know when it comes. And the problem is that we can do nothing. We have to realize that, speaking in military terms, we have to address tactical tasks, strategic tasks, and only in the end we will have the great Russia of the future. We all agree that change in Russia is possible only when Putin quits power. The defeat in Ukraine can trigger such events. It can. But it can also not happen. But I think we all sitting here, it's called Brussels dialogue, so we have two sides. We have Europe, and we have, so to say, Russian consolidated, well, sitting together opposition, not consolidated, of course. We can contribute to this. So if we speak about culture, people are mortal, but sometimes they're also mortal unexpectedly, so no one knows when Putin leaves. It will happen definitely. We know that Putin leaves and change will start in Russia, but no one knows when. So the task for the dialogue participants is to be preparing for this and to be prepared, because the small window will open unexpectedly. Unexpectedly not only for us, but also unexpectedly for those who are in Russia. Unexpectedly for those sitting next to Putin, for those in bureaucracy, oligarchs, military people, security services. For them, disappearance of Putin will be unexpected. And in contrast to us, they have no opportunity to discuss post-Putin life. They are all wiretapped, they are all under surveillance, so they are afraid of this conversation. It's very dangerous to discuss post-Putin Russia in Russia. So our advantage is that we can prepare for this moment and we can say that we want this. I understand I'm taking slightly too long, but what can Europe do? Of course, military occupation of Russia is not an option, and unfortunately we will not have blue-yellow flag over the Kremlin, and we will not have the surrender of Russia. But I think that Europe, and the European Union, and the US have a very strong tool, the carrot. Because we have sticks and carrots, so this carrot that has to be shown to the current political and business elites, they should be told, guys, we want Russia to be peaceful and democratic, because as they say, democracies don't fight each other. For Russia to go through this path quickly, we are ready to integrate you into economic, military and political institutions, and we are ready to abolish sanctions in certain order, to introduce visa-free movement. I don't know what else can be done. You can also be included as associated members, the CFT, like the one signed with Ukraine, etc. One more partnership with NATO. But we need something in return. By constitution, you say that if president is removed from power, in 3 months you have the new presidential election, and we suggest that you announce that 6 months later you have extraordinary parliamentary election for 2 or 3 years of term in power, and this term is necessary for the parties and the politicians to prepare for elections. Many live abroad, many have no access to voters, to money, so that they have time to prepare for normal free elections. Anyway, the first elections will not be free. They might be free, but they will not be fair for everyone. 2 or 2.5 years later, one more election. And later you should have direct elections of governors and regional legislatures in 15 biggest regions. And 6 months later, and 15 more, 6 months later, 15 more. So by 6 months you should rotate the regional elites, come back to 1990 elections, allow electoral blocks, remove all the restriction of being elected and stand for elections. Because millions of people in Russia are not eligible for standing at elections. Also, foreign agents and extremists, all these requirements, what Russia has to do for Europe to include Russia and integrate Russia into economic and political union. And one of the biggest demands, of course, is to have constitutional assembly and creating the new constitution based on the Constitution 1993. What can we do? What should the political opposition do? Our task and our opportunity is to produce meanings. As the discussion in Russia is not possible, we can lead this discussion. We should understand that for every one of us, well, we can draw any dark scenario, like black colonels coming to power, brother-killing war. The Chinese will come, although I don't know how we will talk to them. We might also turn into vassals of China. But I assume discussing what we can do to advance Russia towards the first scenario, the Federation or Confederation, the democratic Russia scenario. The main thing to learn is to agree with each other. And we have to realize there are many issues on which we might disagree. We might disagree on gender equality, women's equality, or animal rights, or on family violence. We might disagree on many things, but if we continue disagreeing while forgetting the main point, that we need to change the fundamental, that everyone should have eligibility to stand for elections, then we will fail. In 1995, Duma elections were held in Russia, State Duma elections, in which 43 parties stood for elections. The 5% threshold was overcome by 4 parties, which in total got 60% of votes. So 40% of parties remained below this threshold. So if we fail to learn to agree, if we all are fragmented, then many of us will have this destiny. Yes, we all have our base, we all have our audience to which we talk, which shares our secondary goals and interests. But if we don't learn to agree on the top level that we need federation with large elements of confederation, that we need shift of money and powers to regions, that we need parliamentary republic, this should be our consolidated position, and this is on what we should agree. Most likely, we will not be in one party or one electoral bloc at these elections, but I don't want to see 40 parties. I think this is the main task that we are facing. And the last point on culture. This morning, I saw the movie of Garibaldian Adagio, the animated cartoon of the year 2000, which gave me optimism. Quite frequently I'm a pessimist, so if you want to get some optimism, please watch this movie. It takes 9 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. To continue our conversation, I'm inviting Fedor KRASHENINNIKOV, publicist and political analyst. Fedor, the floor is yours. Thank you. It's weird to be in this company, in this place. First, I wanted to argue with the first session. Then I was happy that I can support Mr. Mikhail Borisovich. And then still I decided with arguing to Mr. ALEKSASHENKO, mainly on federalism issue. So when we say that we are all for federalism, quite frequently we don't look into details, although we should. When you say we should re-elect governors, and I think that the very idea of electing governors is as dangerous as electing the president. Quite recently I was speaking to a conference on collapse of federalism in some republics of Russia. Everywhere it was the same story. In early 90s, some Democrats came to power, and for 20 years they were destroying the local self-government by keeping re-electing themselves and then being appointed by the president. It's a dangerous idea. The same happens to mayor. First, a charismatic Democrat comes to power, which later governs for 20 years as a non-Democrat. We see the example of Belarus, where in 1994 a young charismatic corruption fighter came to power, and he is still there. So when we speak federalism, we should recomprehend the experience of the old federalism. And when we speak about parliamentarism, we should speak about parliamentarism at all levels, not only federally, but also regionally. These regional barons, which first will kill the local self-government, and then they will give the power to new Putin, we have heard this story already. Something on which I would like to disagree with the first session, this deterministic idea, the law of history and the events of 15th century having this great meaning today. I think that what matters are the mistakes done by people in some very peculiar situations. For example, Russia did not turn to federative democracy in 1917, 1918 because of many mistakes of very specific people, starting with the Tsar and all the way to Kerensky, who came to power and clinged to power rather than building something different. Russia failed to become a full-fledged federation in late 80s and early 90s because of mistakes of Yeltsin and his teams, leading to Putin. Because Yeltsin proved to be weak, first he gave away the power to local barons, killing the local self-government, and then they gave the power to Putin. These are not laws of history, these are mistakes of some people which we should not repeat. When on the new turn of history something might change, and when we speak that we should agree on something, so maybe let's at least agree on not repeating old mistakes. If there are some things that proved wrong in Russia, we should not insist on repeating this. We should not come back to this dead end. Elections of charismatic governors, or some cartel system of federalism when poor regions cannot be independent, and they sell their sovereignty to the federation in return for some transfers, losing everything in the end. These are very important things for which we have to be prepared, so that we don't repeat the simple way, which seems simple. Actually, it's much more complicated. I have seen it all. I'm from a region. I saw how democracy and federalism were dying, and local self-government was dying because no one cared. And the federal level, of course, we need strong, powerful local self-government, which is instrumental. The democracy cannot hang in the air. It was so easy for Putin because there was no fundamental. For democracy and federalism to be sustainable, we need a big army of supporters for whom it matters and who find it comfortable. And the last thing, I will not take that long as another speaker, I would like to tell Mark. A person with an arm in 21st century cannot build democracy or federalism, especially if they sign a manifesto about the call of blood. So if some people in villages of Belgorod region might announce some new federal Russia, I don't believe in it. Building sustainable, effective, contemporary, democratic country can also be only in peaceful situation, consolidated, with elites and population consolidated around some meaningful and comfortable ideas. And I think these ideas should be what I'm offering, not some overwhelming pessimism and some radical revolutionary ideas which intimidate people. And they get them closer to Putin. They think that if Putin is not there, Russia will be lost. So Putin is better than this nightmare for them. I think this is the meanings that we should be producing once we have this happy opportunity to be doing this. Thank you so much for your attention.
Слово предоставляется Владимиру.
The floor goes to Vladimir SLIVYAK. Vladimir SLIVYAK, co-chairman of the Russian environmental group Eco Defense. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. These presentations were extremely interesting. I'm not a politician, I'm an environmentalist activist coming back from the Soviet times, and I have heard many new things for me, and usually in our environment they do not discuss it in our community. Maybe it's good or bad, not for me to judge. And I agree with many of the things said. My personal view on the war in Ukraine is that the war should stop immediately, and certainly Putin's regime should be defeated. But I would like to pay attention to the following, and what I have not heard at this conference at all, and this is a big mistake. Not that we are discussing it here, but that we are not discussing other things. It's a broader landscape. Certainly, it's important to discuss how to defeat Putin, how to change regime, how to redesign Russia, what political system to be chosen and to be implemented is very important, and for us as well, because we will have to be living with this. We will be protecting environment, climate, and it's important for us, for Russia to be democratic, because in the dictatorship, Russia, protecting climate and environment is absolutely impossible. We can see that just like in other sectors of the civil society, the environmental sector cannot work there. There are its own reprisals. Some people are in exile, and those who couldn't relocate, they cannot continue operating. Mr. ALEKSASHENKO said a very nice thing at the very end of his presentation. We are saying to build a new basement, and I think it would be wrong to focus on how we would like to build this foundation now, but it's critically important to think about what is going to be on top of the foundation. It's not only about the political system, but much broader. And here I mean that the future international policy and the role of Russia in this international policy will include not only the issues of policy, democracy, and what is being discussed here. One of the key issues is going to be the climate agenda and energy transition, abandoning fossil fuels. In recent time, I have heard many things from various people who are close to the opposition. The opinion which I would interpret in the following way. We're going to change the regime, we're going to deal with democracy somehow, we're going to build it, and it will be built one day, everything will get better, and then we will continue making money as usual, using or selling oil and gas, so we shouldn't be concerned about it. But you see, the problem is that when Putin was in power in Russia, Russia lagged behind the whole world significantly. Climate, abandoning fossil fuels, energy transition are the key elements of the European policy and of the global policy. And I would like to frustrate those of you who think that this is only a game for the West. No. In my activities, I negotiate on climate under the UN Climate Change Convention. Starting from 1995, every single year, the governments of practically all countries of the world send their delegations to discuss several times a year, in fact, to discuss a new global climate order. This is a new architecture that is going to be defining, and it will impact policy. That's what countries say. By the mid of this century, the climate agenda is going to be the key element of the global policy, of international policy. It's already relevant in many places, but by the mid-century, it will have been dominating. Russia won't be able to sell a lot of fossil fuels and to replenish its state budget, and Russia will face, and is already facing, the necessity to plan energy transition, and will have to build a plan of catching up with others. If we do not have this plan, if we do not think about this plan today, then we won't be accepted in the society of dignity. In 50 years, there will not be any new grade 8. There are new standards in the world, and the standard is you should think about climate, you should strive for energy transition, you have to be climate neutral by the mid of this century. So you will have to either stop or almost stop using fossil fuels. Let's recall the things in Russia. What people use in order to heat their homes, how they generate energy there. This is a gigantic task, and it won't be possible, absolutely impossible. It will be to explain to the whole world why we are not working on it, that we have a special situation, that we need more time than others. Well, we can try explaining it, but then Russia will never be a member of the civilized, developed community. That is why it is critical. And the last thing, this is closer to the Russian reality, not to the international one. Here, they frequently say that a day will come for the Russian voters to vote for the opposition. And the opposition will have to show their ideas to be liked by voters. Voters should be convinced that the opposition is better than the nightmare that is going on there, that the Putin's dictatorship. Yesterday, in the lobby, a group of young people from the Fridays for Future came to me. They're from Russia. Well, they do nothing in Russia anymore. And they didn't know what I was going to be speaking about, and they wanted me to mention climate. Let's look at the people who are here. Do we see 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 20-year-olds? Not many. I think when you think about voters, Russian voters, it's good to understand what young people expect. Undoubtedly, it's important to understand what elderly people, what retired people, mid-aged people think, but quite often, not only in Russia, they ignore the opinions of the youngest, and the future belongs to them. They will have to grab the flags, and they will have to do something. They will have to believe us in order for our actions to be sustained. And these people shall not be excluded, and we should be explaining our climate agenda, our economy transition agenda to them. We will have to get rid of the fossil fuels because that's the pathway of the whole world, and we should understand this along with the things mentioned by others. And I fully agree this, but I think that their position is extremely important to look at it broader. And it's important to work on the issues that are there. There are issues that are important today, and there will be issues that are important tomorrow. If we work for this, if we follow this, then sooner or later the voter will vote for us. Thank you.
Я хочу сказать, что сегодня утром они взорвали Каховскую ГЭС.
I would like to mention that this morning the Kakhovsky reservoir was exploded by them, and 80 settlements in Kherson Oblast on the right-hand side of the river, and on the left-hand side people are flooded to their necks. So it's good that we articulate the issues of climate, but right now somebody is going to sink just because of the explosion of the Kakhovsky reservoir exploded this morning. Okay, we pass the floor to our colleague Vladimir CIMOSZEWICZ, the member of the European Parliament. The floor is yours.
I will speak in English. That is, of course, not my role as a foreigner to suggest to you what kind of constitution or what kind of constitutional system will be the best for Russia. However, I understand that in various constitutional systems, democracy may work well or poorly. And we can see evident examples of that in many countries. We have many countries with weak position of the president, and everything works fine, but sometimes not. Our friends in Hungary decided to equip the very strong prime minister with a power compared to the very strong president, and they have, in result, a very corrupted country with no free media, and country which is under the special procedure of Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union here in Brussels. We have countries with exceptionally strong presidents like the United States, many very often called the most powerful person in the world. Even if that is the over-exaggeration, that shows how powerful is the leader of that country. And democracy is working quite well, or at least has been working quite well. Nowadays, sometimes facing problems, like in many other European democratic countries, also here in Europe. What, in my opinion, is the most important is a constitutional division of powers and effective, truly working system of assurances, of guarantees, that that system of separation of power will be respected, will not be changed. Otherwise, that is always possible that pathologies may one day prevail for those or other reasons. What I can also say is, reacting to your, Mr. FEYGIN, or not so much proposal, but rather a question, if it will be good, for instance, to announce a new constitution at, let's say, liberated parts of Russian territory. Of course, constitution is a legal instrument, but I would suggest not to instrumentalize it especially for tactical reasons. It's too important. I'm afraid that now you have that system or that situation in your country. I remember that one day Madame Tereshkova proposed constitutional changes. Duma immediately adopted them. Then you had fake referendum and accepted that, getting the president almost for life. I believe that constitution should be treated truly very seriously, and that should be demonstrated also by democratic opposition. I understand that there might be some temporary solutions. For instance, in my country, at the beginning of the 90s, we still were not able to adopt a final constitution of democratic Poland, but we adopted so-called small constitution, regulating temporarily the relations between the top powers of all of their kinds. And then it took us a couple of years to work out the constitution. I had the honor to be the member of this committee and for a period of time to chair it. It took us 3 years of very open and very inclusive process to discuss the final draft of constitution, which later on was accepted in a true, fair, democratic referendum. And that was difficult. It's much easier, of course, to hire some experts and draft constitution in 2 weeks. But then it pays out. When in the last years we got the government not respecting the constitution, suddenly millions of ordinary Polish people started defending it. And people understand today how important it is for them individually to defend the democratic constitution, to defend their rights and so on. What is very important is, of course, the problem of political culture and the conscience of the ordinary people. What do they understand from the Constitution? Do they understand their rights? Do they understand the ways of defending their rights? Are they ready to defend their rights? Of course, in case of Russia, as I may say, it is probably one of the most important issues, since there is no tradition of defending democratic rights by the people. But that is a difficult way toward a stable, well-working democracy in the future. We had, let me also comment very briefly some statements or suggestions made by other panelists. Mr. GURIEV spoke about the need of having a kind of roundtable talks between some people from that regime camp and some representatives of the opposition. That is, of course, up to you to decide what is right, what is wrong. But let me tell you that negotiations, roundtable negotiations, which started in February 1989, were a starting point for our political change. And that happened for the first time in the Soviet bloc, that the government, the ruling party, recognized the very existence of the opposition, and understanding how limited was its ability, I mean the government, to rule the country, decided to talk with the opposition. And that opened the way for first semi-democratic elections, which resulted in fundamental change of political and economic system of our country. So sometimes that is not a bad idea, I believe. We all remember 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, together with the president of Poland of that time, Mr. KRASHENINNIKOV, as a foreign minister. I participated again in roundtable negotiations in Kiev. Which helped to have fair elections, presidential elections in that country. And but by the way, I believe that it was still time when Mr. Putin wanted to control Ukraine without use of force or hard force. In that time, he visited Ukraine several times to support Mr. Yanukovych. And I think that he was very much disappointed when finally, implementing the decision by the Supreme Court of Ukraine, elections were repeated and Mr. Yushchenko was elected the president. So this is a working method. At least in that time in Ukraine, they managed to avoid bloodshed on the streets of Kiev, which was, of course, very, very important. Mr. KHODORKOVSKY spoke against lustration or general lustration. And again, I must say that in 1989, with the first non-communist government in Poland of Mr. Mazowiecki, that was stated that lustration was to be, let's say, arranged, made in special services, in police, in judiciary. Yes, in judiciary as well. So those judges who were actively fighting the opposition before were expelled from the profession, from the courts. But all the rest got a chance to work for a new country on equal basis. That was not so much, let's say, tactical move. That was, in my opinion, in my feeling, my impression was that that was a little bit idealistic. Most of us believe that all the people have the chance in such a special moment in history of our country to take part, to do something positive. And in general, it worked. Later on, we got lustration on the initiative of right conservative forces in Poland, and the only result was a deepening division of the society. Today, 34 years after the beginning of change, lustration divides our society very, very deeply and creates a lot of hostility between the people. In my opinion, that is the wrong way. However, very difficult is to accept that idea, to forgive people responsible for wrongdoing in the past. In this panel, we were supposed to discuss also new foreign policy of Russia, but the only person I heard mentioning one of the problems was Mr. Akunin, who said that the situation, the policy of Russia may result in Russia becoming the junior part of China. I must say, I was foreign minister of my country, and of course I have followed Russian foreign policy, and some of Russian leaders I collaborated with. In some cases, I remember that with satisfaction. I had very good working relations with Igor Ivanov as your foreign minister. We managed to regulate many Polish-Russian difficult issues together. But when several years ago I was asked at the conference in Hamburg, what do I think about Russian foreign policy, I said, in my opinion, as I understand it, it is suicidal. In my opinion, it didn't, and it continues not to fit the needs of Russia, as I understand them. Of course, it is always the first duty of a leader, of the leaders, of the leading forces, to define the priorities. What is the most important? In my case, in the case of my country, in those days when I had something to say, sometimes quite much, the most important was how to guarantee security for Poland. When your foreign minister, Evgeny Primakov, visited me in Warsaw many years ago and started talking why Poland should not join NATO, I told him that I'm very much in favor of developing positive relations between our two countries, but under one condition, that Russian leaders accept the very simple rule. Decisions related to Polish security are taken in Warsaw, not in Moscow. And if that is accepted, we can then move forward in many other areas. We decided to join Western Alliance, NATO, and I believe that was the right decision. Today, from the present perspective, it looks even more rational than 30 years ago when we applied for NATO membership. Then, of course, that was what was the most important is what fits the best our development and, in result, improvement of the living conditions of our people. And I simply cannot understand that kind of policy of Russia in the last 20 or almost 20 years, especially after the 2007 Munich statement by Mr. Putin, which meant just a break with the West. How Russia could and can modernize its economy to make it more competitive without close cooperation with Western economies, highly developed countries. I do not understand that. What is the sense of splitting with the West, of cutting ties with the West, and becoming more and more dependent on the Asian superpower your neighbors. Sometimes I have a feeling, probably I'm wrong, that some leaders of Russia still believe that it is a situation comparable to the one existing 50, 60 years ago, with powerful Soviet Union and very poor and poorly doing China. Something has changed in those years, and the proportions of the potential and of possibilities are completely different nowadays. I believe that even after political change, which is so important not only for you, for everybody here in Europe and not only in Europe, after the change and with the best will of new leaders of Russia, not everything can be reversed. Not everything can come back to the situation or potential situation from before. For instance, as a result of the aggression against Ukraine, as a result of sanctions and counter-sanctions, as you know, Europe has limited our imports of energy resources by something like 90% from Russia. That process would take place even without the war, but not so fast. Because in the times of our new Green Deal, we are very sensitive on ecological issues. In the next 15 years, we would probably reduce our imports of energy resources from Russia by 70%. We did it in 1 year by 90%, and that is irreversible. We will not come back to the earlier situation. And that is, in fact, very positive for everybody. For everybody. That was quite risky, we were afraid of that, but we managed to survive and to do everything quite well. I believe that rethinking the fundamental elements and concepts of Russian foreign policy is truly of vital importance for your country. And I believe that it would be great if Russia can adopt a much more balanced policy. I don't think that anti-Chinese policy would be wise in your situation, but coming back to positive relations with the West, with Western Europe, with the European Union, without trying attempts to divide us and to just continue good relations with chosen individual member countries, with the United States and so on, would be very important. Not only in terms of economy, making business, but also in terms of deteriorating global security. We should come back to all those regulations from the 70s, on many occasions adopted decades ago, which guaranteed the world high level of security, for instance, nuclear security and so on. Thank you very much.
We've exhausted the agenda and we have 5 minutes left. I would suggest, since we did not manage to answer a few questions from the audience, from the floor, the next panel is coming, but let's take a quick round of comments. We have half a minute for this, half a minute each. I fully agree with Grigory Shalovich about relations between Russia and China. This alliance, I believe that democratic Russia is needed to the West also for Russia not to become the partner of China, either junior partner or province, but the very alliance of two dictatorships will be more horrible to the world than the pay that is needed to absorb Russia into the democratic community. Mikhail KHODORKOVSKY. I already used enough time. Okay, good. I will briefly say that when we criticize the idea that the division of Russia is good, I would like to say that after the breakup of the USSR, it was good only for a few countries, the Baltic states, and in Central Asia, the situation turned not so good or even worse than during the Soviet times at the level of households. So we should remember this before we welcome this idea as it happens in other fora. That's all I wanted to say. Okay, then, okay, let's wrap up. The opinions have been expressed. In some cases, they differed, but they are not complementary to one another. In a number of cases, I would like to say that the issue about the new constitution, if applied to Russia, seems very theoretical, because a Russian person, a Russian individual, if we speak about the personal freedoms and the public good through the optics of Rousseau or French philosophers, a Russian person wouldn't understand usually that the constitution is for him or her. I was the member of the parliament, and in 1993 I could see how after the October 93 the constitution was adopted, millions voted for it. For some of them, for those who lived for those 30 years, is it relevant for them? Do they pressure it? Can the constitution unite people? I mean, in Russia, do they believe that for the sake of this new constitution, or any constitution that is going to serve their interest, they are ready to sacrifice for it? We do not see it. We do not see it totally. We can see the opposite. People neglect their rights that are declared in the Constitution. Constitution says about its direct application. The norms in the Constitution are directly applied. The Constitution has any case of direct application? For many, the Constitution is a small auxiliary paraphernalia which shows the relations between the state and the people, and the state will always prevail. We will have to transform Russian society and live through years in order for new priorities to emerge there, that like the private would prevail, not the state. It requires decades, but do we have these decades? Does Russia have these decades to re-educate its society? Maybe there are different views, but we are in the situation when the current regime fully ignores the society and its opinion, and it commits the most horrible crimes. Today, they explode Kakhovsky Reservoir, and tomorrow they can explode the Zaporozhye NPP. The toolkit is short. And speaking of the future, Russia can stay within its boundaries or can lose the boundaries, not because somebody wants it or not. These things happen quite often, historically, in a natural way. The disintegration of empire is a natural process, like in the 60s, colonies disintegrated. The civilized West decided to get rid of them because it was a burden for it. And the entire 20th century sticks to this empiric past. And they reproduce this at a new cycle, and they repeat the previous practices. Let's restore geopolitically, politically within these borders. And in the outcome, it loses even more. And probably we're facing the stage when, like, there was the breakup in 1991, and we will see another division, and this is arithmetic. And this country is 17,200,000 square kilometers. This huge country will lose, and it will reincarnate the same idea. We have to restore revenge. Re-establishment is the core idea, changing the mindset of the people. That's the task for the civil society, political structures, opposition and immigration, Russian communities that here can generate these ideas and discuss them and return those ideas back to Russia. Russian political immigration always failed. The only experience is Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. That's it. Therefore, I believe that this discussion was useful. I believe that other panels will touch upon these or similar issues, and thank you very much.